So as you know, these sessions are usually recorded. So once the event is over, we will have a link available to it. And we expect that by 5:20, you'll be able to move to the next event, which is a high-level panel on the same, where our principal, Ms. Inga Anderson, as well as the head of the IMF and a number of ministers will be participating. Now, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and invite Professor of Environmental Economics at Oxford, Cameron Hepburn, to make a few remarks. Go ahead, Cameron.
Thanks, Keisha. It's very, very delightful for me to be here with you all today. I'm sorry that some of you couldn't be physically with us at the Dreaming Spires of Oxford, but it's been a difficult 12 months for people everywhere across the planet. And this year, we are seeing the combination of these three crises, the COVID crisis, the credit crisis that's related to the debt that's being built up, and also, of course, the climate crisis and the crisis of nature in the background. But as we watch countries moving from the rescue phase of the pandemic crisis into the recovery phase, we need to be thinking hard about how countries can sensibly pull their economies out of the mess that they're in, and looking to the future, not to the past, building up the kind of assets, the jobs that are fit for purpose for the future. And the Oxford Economic Recovery Project at the Smith School that Brian O'Callaghan, who you hear from in a moment, has been leading, has been examining these questions. How do we use this COVID-19 recovery to restore economies, but in a way that makes them directed to where we need to go in the future, living in harmony with nature, with net zero emissions? It's obviously huge. This year, we've got the Glasgow conference on climate change. We've got to bend these curves and get our economies on towards net zero. And we know there are huge sums going out the doors already, around, very roughly 15 trillion. You can see all the data in what we're about to launch today. And Joe Biden's 1.9 trillion package is expected to go through the door today in the House of Reps in the US. Now, some of you will have read and covered the paper last year in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, which was joint with Joe Stiglitz, who'll be joining us later, Nick Stern, Dimitri Zengelis, and Brian. And that paper showed how spending on green programs can be just as good for the economy as traditional spending programs, and actually very often better. So what that paper did was kind of clear the decks of this ridiculous idea that there is some kind of conflict or trade-off between spending on the environment and spending to recover the economy. It's just simply not true. And it shows that the opposite is in fact correct. And so what we're going to be looking at today is whether that spending, those insights have been incorporated into spending. Now, I don't want to steal the headlines, but of course, you'll see there have been some missed opportunities, but it's not too late. And what we're looking at today is what we can learn from the successes and how we can act responsibly now. And so today we'll be launching this new Global Recovery Observatory, which we're thrilled to do jointly with UNEP, with UNDP, with the IMF, with GIZ and PAGE. This is a great team effort bringing together multiple different institutions to provide a tool for the entire world to shine a light on what's actually been happening and to learn from that light as to how we can push ourselves towards the right sort of action in future. And with that, I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to my colleague Brian for some more detail. Thanks.
I'll jump right in there. Hi all, it's lovely to join you, and thank you, genuinely, thank you for taking an interest in our work, which includes today the Global Recovery Observatory, as well as our new report, which hopefully you all have a copy of. Really, your contributions in covering this will help to keep governments around the world accountable as we emerge from the grips of the COVID-19 pandemic and move forward beyond that. So perhaps that's a good place to start. The purpose of our project is to bring transparency to government spending and put power in the hands of citizens to ensure their leaders are acting in their best interests. It's about maximizing future prosperity, where prosperity is driven by, and we say this in the paper too, it's driven by innovation, good jobs and growth, and supported by a sustainable climate, healthy ecosystems and landscapes. Let me tell you a little bit more about the Global Recovery Observatory. So the project was started by Oxford last March and continues to be maintained by Oxford. obviously partnered with UNEP and UNDP and the others, as Cameron mentioned, but maintained by Oxford, as the point is to remain outside of the influence of countries and institutions that might have a conflict of interest when it comes to assessing spending. So really, we see this as the world's tool to bring transparency to government spending practices. So the observatory tracks government spending in over 50 countries, and we're actually in the process of expanding it to cover, I think it's 89 by the end of March. At the moment, we have nearly 4,000 policy items in there and 30,000 data points, all assessed, each of these policies assessed for potential social and environmental impacts using a brand new 100-page long methodology. So everything is being made publicly available today and will be updated on a weekly basis going forward. As I said, this is a transparency tool created by the people and for the people. That's the point. So the headline of the report itself is that in 2020, the world was largely not spending in a way that supported environmental progress. Many governments missed significant economic opportunities in their recovery spending, and it's not good enough. As simple as that. It is not good enough. Government recovery efforts are so far incommensurate with the scale of the planetary crises of climate change, nature loss, and pollution. In many cases, spending just hasn't matched Build Back Better rhetoric. Again, citizens should not be okay with that. We find that in 2020, governments announced $14.6 trillion in spending, of which $1.9 trillion was for recovery. Now, for recovery, that's an important point for readers, viewers everywhere. When it comes to economic crises, there are two types of fiscal spending: short-term rescue initiatives and long-term recovery initiatives. Rescue spending is essential and it's designed to keep businesses and people alive: vaccine funding, unemployment payments, business liquidity. Recovery spending, on the other hand, is where governments reinvigorate their economies. And here they have far more discretion. And so it's where we focus on assessing greenness. So that's my point, focus on recovery spending. Overall, in that recovery spending, we find that $341 billion, or 18% of recovery spending, is green and thereby positively supports environmental outcomes, including climate change. But the remaining 82% is not. Much of that non-green spending represents significant missed opportunities. Of the spending that was green, the majority came from actually a very small group of high-income nations, mostly European. And so the 18%, in some ways just hides even worse performance from other nations like my home of Australia at 2%. Following from the crisis, rational governments should now be investing in opportunities that best set up future prosperity. Green spending, we find, based on the paper Cameron mentioned from last May and additional literature, green spending can bring big economic returns, frequently higher than dirty and traditional alternatives. And green spending can simultaneously create more jobs and help to reduce social inequalities. In developing economies, and this is really the last major point, green spending can also support sustainable development. Developing economies so far have seen far less spending, and that's not through any fault of their own. This is a result of expensive access to finance that just don't have the capability to spend. One of the key figures is that so far we've seen about $20,800 spent per person on average in advanced economies. In emerging and developing economies, it's $680. 20,800 versus 680. And in some of the least developed countries, we're talking at $10 per person or less. So developing economies just don't have that access to capital. And the ultimate result is a backslide of, some say, up to a decade in development and significantly increased poverty, bringing more death. And as a result, advanced economies can't conscionably stand by and do nothing. So as a next step, the implications for government representatives are to use the Global Recovery Observatory to understand how other nations have been spending green and to follow suit. For citizens, the Global Recovery Observatory can be used to hold leaders to account. And it's here that I'm going to pass over to Joy Kim, who has been a fantastic partner in building the Oxford UNEP collaboration from day one.
Thanks very much, Brian. Just before Joy comes in, I just wanted to remind the media that we have that Q&A box. So if you have questions, even at the moment, please feel free to send those in, and we'll hope to answer them before 5:20. Now I'll pass you over to Joy Eri Kim, who is a climate change expert with UNEP. Over to you, Joy.
Thank you very much, Keisha, and thank you, Brian, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. From UNEP's side, indeed, this Global Recovery Observatory, the partnership with the Oxford, really comes at the heart of our work on green fiscal policy, which started in 2011 as a part of a broader our efforts on supporting countries' green economy transition. And under that, we have also established Green Fiscal Policy Network in partnership with the IMF and the German Development Agency. And the objective of the network is really to provide the platforms where we bring the Ministry of Finance and Environment together, and they can share their experiences of reforming fiscal policy for sustainability. So it really coincides very well with this new partnership that we have with Oxford on monitoring and observing the recovery spending under this initiative that we have. And Brian mentioned about the transparency being served by this observatory. From our perspective, in addition to that, we believe that transparency actually leads to the efficiency and effectiveness of government spending, as we have been working with countries to support their efficient government spending and their public investment for sustainability. That's the objective of our green fiscal policy work. So just a few words in terms of next steps that you may be wondering about, how we would actually like to use this observatory. As UNEP actually is working with the countries around the world, we have already been communicating and supporting with countries' recovery plan. I think that the observatory provides very good tools, which also allows countries to learn from other countries' green expenditures and good examples, but also it can actually help countries to understand better and design better their green recovery policies that is better aligned with the sustainability. That's one of the next steps that we have. We certainly envision the upgraded version of the tracker under this observatory, continuing our partnerships with the Oxford and others, strengthening further about the three planetary crises that Brian mentioned, and nature, pollution, and climate change. And as you can see in the report, it actually talks about the indications of potential impacts of green spending. But as we actually work closely with the countries, our plan is to provide a more quantitative assessment of impacts of green spending as we actually support countries' green recovery policy development. And lastly, as countries actually move from recovery spending to regular government budgetary, we believe that this taxonomy developed for the tracker can actually provide a very good basis for a green public finance framework that can actually help countries to design and monitor better their green spending for sustainability. So these are some of the three next steps, if you like, that we would like to launch on, building on the observatory work that we actually partnered with Oxford and other partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joy. Just passing you on to our last speaker now, who is Mr. Stephen Stone, the Chief of the Resources and Markets Branch in UNEP's Economy Division. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Keisha. And colleagues, there's not much left to say, really. I have a few points that I want to build on from what Cameron's provided. Brian, your very good summary of what's inside of this report and the data set. Enjoy the context you provided. I guess there were just two or three things I'd say. I mean, one is we're at a very critical juncture right now. The window is open for transformational change, transformational spending, transformational investment. And as Cameron said, there are, at least as UNEP sees it, a triple planetary crisis right now. There is climate instability, there is nature loss, and there are growing levels of pollution. This is the backdrop for the report itself. And for those of you who follow UNEP, you may know that UNEP's medium-term strategy was approved about 2 weeks ago at the UN Environment Assembly by ministers from around the world. And our medium-term strategy is totally to address these 3 planetary crises, which result from unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. This investment is the way that happens. That's the way the change happens. So this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And adding to this, we have 10 years until the 2030 agenda becomes reality. We have 10 years to build towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which Secretary General Guterres has called our best and our only plan for the future. So every dollar counts, every euro counts, every yen counts. And this is a tool that helps us navigate towards that future. As Brian said, it's an open source effort. The data is completely open for the first time. Over 3,500 policy interventions, so many data points. And colleagues, you can go onto the data portal, which is now live on UNDP and on Oxford, and go to every country and look at all those different policies where the money is being placed for the future, for the present in terms of recovery and in terms of rescue, and for the future in terms of recovery. So just tremendously important tool, in my sincere appreciation to Oxford, to UNDP, and to all the partners who are making this possible. And if we could, I would leave that link in the chat box, and I'll do so as soon as I finish speaking. We are planning to ramp up, and Latin America and the Caribbean has been a huge supporter. An additional 30 countries are so coming on board for the observatory. In fact, we're told that the Council of Ministers, the Forum of Ministers, will be adopting this platform as their tracking device for Latin America. So a lot of traction also through the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, which is additional 20 countries in the world. So we are heading towards 90, 100 of the top economies in the world, which is really capturing where most of the action is. The last thing I wanted to say is, making this tool available everywhere and to everyone. Cameron, you spoke about the Biden package, which is probably going to pass the House today, 1.9 trillion. Behind the Biden package is an additional infrastructure spend on recovery between 2 to 3 trillion. We don't know the exact shape or form or how that might land, but the point is there are a tremendous amount of resources every day, every year that are coming forward. This pandemic recovery spending is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but behind that, every year, between 18 and 22% of global GDP is capital formation. Those resources need to be geared towards the future. We need economies that produce wealth without producing liabilities, that produce well-being without producing risks. And that's the point of the observatory, to help us navigate to that future. So with that, Keisha, back to you, and thanks very much again.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks very much, colleagues, for these really enlightening presentations. I think we'll go straight into some questions, as we only have 30 minutes exactly. So I'll start with one from Seth Borenstein from the Associated Press. I know Brian and Stephen, you both talked about the Biden administration's recent recovery bill. So this is something that perhaps you can address. What percentage would you say is sustainable of the Biden $1.9 trillion recovery bill? And what percentage is the goal globally? And what is the goal for such a big emitter or big economy like the US? What grade would you give the US?
I'm happy to start here. So far, spending from the US has been almost all rescue oriented. And as a result, the expectation wouldn't be for a lot of it to be green. It's gone to stimulus checks, to liquidity support for businesses, etc. There have been a few instances of dirty spending, I think in some of the bailout packages that have been provided, but on whole, far majority, let's say 98%, has been rescue and neutral. So in terms of the grade, it's rescue. But there's significant opportunity ahead. And as Stephen mentioned, we already know of Biden's plans to invest significant capital in green initiatives in the next round of COVID support. And we're hopeful that the administration is able to pass some of those aspirations through Congress. I'm not sure, Stephen, if you're able to give an idea as to what would, what we should be asking for, or if you can provide any further thoughts there.
Yeah, perhaps, Brian, just to say that it is a tremendous opportunity, and we know where the sectors with the biggest bang for the buck, both in terms of job-rich recovery, as well as some of the growth and the income multipliers. And Cameron, that's thanks to the research that you've done earlier. So they're in mobility, clean mobility, they're in clean energy, they're in building retrofits. We know where they are. R&D, for example, is hugely important. So there's tremendous opportunities there moving forward. Thanks very much. Back to you, Keisha.
Thanks both. Now the next question is from Reuters, from Megan Rowling. It says, this project is intended to keep governments accountable, but given there's a very short window to get these spending measures right for a net zero greener world, what are the actual mechanisms citizens can use to make that happen, especially when many are struggling on a personal level? Even if they are not okay with what is happening in the real world, what can they do to change the course of how their tax dollars are being spent? Maybe I'll come to you, Stephen, because I heard you talking about what citizens can do and what governments can do.
Okay. Yeah, I think we all have a responsibility here, Keisha and colleagues, which is to lift our ambition. This is an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. Obviously, it's not an opportunity that anyone wanted. Nobody expected we'd get hit with a pandemic or much less a global lockdown, but we have. And it's forced us to reevaluate everything, including how we spend our public resources. So I think this tool is just so valuable because it puts all that out into the open. People can track how they're doing. Governments can look at their peers and see what are their peers doing that's of interest to them. Where can they find these growth multipliers, these job multipliers? That's the kind of tool that we want to put into the hands of governments and the people who support their governments. Thanks, Keisha.
Cameron, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think Megan's asked a really great question there. This is vital. Time is short. You know, what can we all do individually and collectively? And I think a huge part of the story is in spreading the word. So going back to Stephen's point about transparency, you know, if you don't know how your tax dollars are being spent, you can't complain about it. You can't vote against it. And so all of you tuning into this press briefing actually have a very important role, which is to spread the word, make sure that countries can be compared and frankly shamed if necessary. Brian mentioned his home country of Australia. It's also mine too, but much further in the past, I suppose. And we need to call out countries that are not doing what they need to be doing in their own best interest for the future. And then the citizens of those countries need to knock on the doors of their parliamentarians, or at least perhaps tweet at them on social media. And certainly when there is a vote, express their preferences through those channels. But I think, Megan, you're right that it's quite important to build up a clear voice that is calling for this. And I think actually we have had that voice calling for it. And what we're seeing now is that, you know, this is the time for delivery now. We haven't seen a full-on slam dunk green recovery just yet. And if we continue this way for another 6 months, it will be an epic missed opportunity.
Thank you. Stephen, you wanted to go? Go ahead.
I just wanted to come in and say, you know, is the glass half full or half empty? We're also seeing some really remarkable examples of leadership here on green spending, green recovery spending. And just to name a couple of them, I mean, the work being done by France on energy and building retrofits, for example, as part of the France Relance, the work of South Korea in R&D, literally tens of millions of dollars in green R&D, in Germany, clean energy, hydrogen, for example. So there are numerous opportunities and examples, is what I want to say, of leadership. The amounts are not where they should be, but the idea here is to lift everyone's ambition level. And the details of those different policy initiatives are available on the data tracker, which I've dropped into the chat box. And I encourage all of you to just go and explore, because every country has the full listing, and you can see what's been classified as green and the kind of impact it will have based on the Oxford research. So I encourage you to explore and look at that. Thanks, Keisha. Back to you.
Thank you, Stephen. There's a quick follow-up from Seth at AP, who says a crucial definition question, since there once was a different British definition for billion. When we are talking billion, are we talking 1,000 millions and trillion being a million? That is $1 billion is a billion with the nine zeros, and a trillion is a billion with 12 zeros.
Yes, 9 zeros.
If I can come in on that one.
Zeros, right, okay.
Keisha, well, Brian, you can correct me on the UK translation. But I just wanted to share an anecdote from our French translation where a trillion is actually translated as a billion, and so we had a few hiccups there, but we've ironed them out. We are talking about trillions, and we are talking about billions. So the overall spend is actually 15 trillion, 14.6 to be correct.
Okay.
Yes,
I hope,
just to be crystal clear, because I think maybe I broke up for a second there. 1 billion has 9 zeros. 1 trillion has 12 zeros.
Great. All right. I thought that cleared it up for me anyway. I hope it helps. We'll move on to the next question, which is from Michelle Langrand from Geneva Solutions. And the question is, what percentage of recovery spending from being green should governments aim for? Brian, maybe I'll start with you.
I actually think that this is a good one for Stephen, but to start with, I would say that overall, there is no single number. Countries have different capacities to spend and different internal strategic priorities, of course. And they're also at different points along, let's call it the green technology curve or the green development curve. In some countries, spending can be more productive when lower if it's better used, right? So for example, in the UK, because the UK's renewable energy sector has developed to quite significantly and leads in many ways, particularly in offshore wind, it wouldn't make as much sense for a government to be spending public funds in those areas and more significant funds in those areas. Instead, should be focusing on catalyzing private capital to come in. So for a whole variety of reasons, there is no single number that's constant across all economies. But Cameron is certainly more of an expert on the economics of this, and Stephen, I know, has thought about this too.
I'm certainly happy to add a few thoughts. So it's a nice question, and one we've asked ourselves. I mean, in a sense, from principle, you go back to saying, what is the marginal value of spend in each of these different categories? Because of course, it'd be really odd if 100% of spending were green. You want spending on schools and hospitals and other forms of capital, human capital, social capital, etc. So it's not just a natural capital spend that we're interested in here. One thing that's very clear that we can focus on, Michelle, is that the percentage of spending that should be brown at this point in human civilization, given the targets we have, is very clearly zero. So if that is a positive number anywhere, you should go to town naming and shaming. But on your exact question, what is the right number? I think Brian's given you two good things to think about there. So one is, if you're a country already very rich in natural capital, it may be that you don't need vast amounts more. You need to protect and conserve what you have. If you're a country that's very poor, that you've got lots of emissions, lots of pollution, perhaps you're deforesting or whatever, then you need to get going on this. And there's very high